The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Loving God, you know us better than we know ourselves. Lead us on this journey of Lent so that we may come ever closer to you. Through Jesus Christ we pray. Amen. So this morning, the idea was just to get some people talking about what they do for their Lenten practices, and then get you all talking about what you do or are thinking about doing or have done in the past that has worked or not worked for Lenten practices. So a very open agenda this morning. And so if anyone would like to go first, Elise is brimming with enthusiasm.
I love Lent. Start with her. I absolutely adore it, and I'll talk about what the church, what St. Paul's is doing in our liturgies, and what you'll see if you haven't been to the services yet, because it's a stark difference for anybody that's been to the service already. We, for Lent, to mark the season, we immediately start with the Decalogue. So we go through the 10 Commandments, and we're kneeling through that. And then we say the confession after the Decalogue, and then move on with the service as usual. You'll hear music that is sort of more dirgy than you're used to, which I love. And then I'm trying to think. We don't process. The choir does not process, so you'll be missing those things. And it's all in order to just sort of shift our bodies and shift what the church is doing to say that we are now in the season of Lent. Other offerings that we have, you can find in these lovely resource packets, but ones that I want to highlight, starting with this great book called Speaking of Sin by Barbara Brown Taylor. We spoke about it at the Pious Pint, and people were really enthralled and wanted to learn more. So we said, well, let's make it a parish book study. If you would like to purchase, now this is my favorite part, if you'd like to purchase the book, you can text SIN to pay for the book. I love it. So that's one offering. And then later on in the adult forums, later on in Lent, we have a book discussion. We'll have a book discussion on that. On Tuesdays in Lent, we have our cloister nights, 6:30 to 8 o'clock, starting in the chapel. This year we're doing something a little bit different. We're starting with Eucharist, then Simple Supper, and then we're ending with the Stations of the Cross, which is particularly good to review during Lent. Catholics would say every Friday, but we're not Catholic. So for Lent, we've changed that up for cloister nights. So if you can't make it to the whole cloister night event, you can still come to the Stations of the Cross at 7:45. Then what else? The adult forums with Frank Wade next week. It's a 3-part series. And I think that's it. Anything else for the...
We're starting a book on contemplative practices on Wednesday morning. It's going to be once a month.
Excellent.
Wednesday mornings, starting the 20th.
Excellent. Yeah. We're starting the Spiritual Direction Center for Spiritual Direction is starting a once a month book study.
Well, yeah. Book center. Discussion.
What are you calling it?
Calling it contemplative reading.
Excellent. Contemplative reading.
And
Amy.
And on Sunday nights before the 5 o'clock service, we're going to have quiet prayer, silent prayer in the chapel before the service. And when the bell rings for the service to start, those of us who are in the chapel will move to the nave for the worship service. And we will also be starting a meditation group on Wednesday mornings. That will start probably the 27th. It will be the week after book discussion. So if you want to go to the contemplative reading and then come to a meditation the following week, you can do that.
Great.
We're also talking about spiritual direction. Lent's a great time to begin spiritual direction.
And then final thing, now that just reminded me, another thing that
we're trying to sort of push is the rite of reconciliation, or also known as confession. It's actually practiced in the Episcopal Church, but we don't really promote that. But we're trying to promote that. Lent is a especially good season to do that. If you have questions or you're wondering how to do that, seek out Elizabeth, myself, or Oren, and we're happy to set aside a time and talk through what it is and what we'll do. And we have a few folks that already do it because they are a part of special orders, and they find it very rewarding. So, who's ever next is happy to step right.
Good morning. Many of you know that I'm a part of an order called the Order of Julian of Norwich, and I thought I'd start by sharing a little bit of what they do during the Lenten season as a way to introduce this. These are folks who live in community, and their practice is to fast during Lent. And what that means is they have a regular breakfast like they would normally have breakfast, but then they fast for the rest of the day until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. In other words, they forego a noonday meal. They skip that meal, and then at 3 o'clock, and the significance of that is that's the time that Jesus dies on the cross, and at that point they end their fast with a gathering. They have cheese and nuts and fruit as a way of breaking the fast, and then in the evening they have a normal evening meal. So that's what they call a day of fast, and they do that throughout the season of Lent, except, of course, for feast days, and this is one of them, folks. If you gave up something for Lent, today's a feast day. It's okay. You can, I talk to people about that, and they always say, "Oh no, I couldn't. I have to do this, the whole season. They can't." But at least in the monastic community, they do observe the feast days, whether they're in Lent or not. Even there's some other feast days like St. Joseph's Day normally occurs during Lent, and that's a full feast day, and they break their fast. They don't follow the same rules that they do during the regular Lenten days. On a more personal note, for me, one of the things, I'm a news junkie, and I find myself in the morning, first thing I do, I wake up, I turn on the radio and start listening to what's happening in the news, and throughout the day, I get in the car, I start listening to what's happening in the news, and get home at night, and the first thing I do is turn on the news to keep up with what's going on. We're all kind of on pins and needles about seeing what outrageous is going to happen next in our government, I think. But so my Lenten discipline this year is to not do that. In other words, to turn off all of that noise in the background, and the intention, of course, is that becomes a time for me to pray and to be open and to listen for God's presence in my life, and to find that more revealed. I want to share with you something that this again goes back to the Order of Julian. Every Sunday, when they get together for Eucharist, the warden of the order offers what's called a chapter talk. It's like their sermon. It's not as long as a sermon, but it's like that. And I want to share what she said this last Sunday at their Sunday Eucharist. This is her chapter talk. She said, "We're coming up again to Lent, the time in which St. Benedict invites us to, quote, wash away in this holy season the negligences of other times, to tighten the bowstring just a bit." I love that metaphor, to tighten the bowstring just a bit. There are a few ways we could go about this. You know how there are some very deep, comfortable chairs that once you get into them and are settled, maybe with a cup of something hot and a book, it takes a great amount of effort with perhaps a touch of annoyed resentment on the side if you have to get up and do something. You could call this the, well, okay, whatever you want way of approaching Lent. One could go on at this one could also, that's the first way that she says you could observe Lent. And one also could go at it in an officious and even self-despising way, as a program of more or less violent self-improvement, a reset of maybe failing New Year's resolutions or something like that. But there's a third way, and that is, to quote St. Benedict again, to run on the path ahead, our hearts overflowing with love. We could choose this because, as Julian says, Jesus continually looks upon us with pity and not with blame, always turning toward us the face of constant love that believes in us and in our goodness. We can choose to run with energy and anticipation the love of Christ and all the other graduates, known and unknown, urging us on. Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to go next just because Sam has given me a wonderful segue. And I, too, am fasting from the news. There is hardly ever a time when something in the news makes me feel better. I don't know about you, but, almost everything I hear is an outrage or something that makes me angry. And, I don't want to miss news about a new cure for a disease. But, and I know that big report we're all waiting for, somebody will let me know when that happens. So it's only been a few days, right? But I already feel calmer, happier. It's not just about being happy, it's about also, as Sam indicated, having time for other things. So one of those things is reading, and we just had a number of suggestions for books. The book group here at St. Paul's is reading a book called The Last Week by Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, which, as you know, the Gospels vary a lot in the events of Jesus' last week, and so this tries to synthesize them, but pays special attention to Mark's Gospel, which goes Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Sunday to Sunday. So I invite you to consider reading that book. It goes pretty quickly, and we'll meet on March 20th to talk about that. So it's a short month this time. But what I mainly wanted to talk to you about, now that I've talked so much, is silence. So probably 25 years ago, I heard a homily that invited us to enjoy some silence. Often in our culture, silence is not something that is presented as something to enjoy, but something to kind of endure. A couple of fears about that. One, I'll be bored. Two, what will I hear? What will I think about? What will be revealed to me? So I began to just enjoy silence in my car, which I had a really long commute at that time from southern Maryland to downtown D.C. And instead of listening to the radio, we didn't even have a 24-hour news cycle back then. I don't know if y'all can remember all that. But it was just music and whatnot. I began to enjoy some silence. And in that silence, I began to practice reciting the prayer of St. Francis, or the prayer attributed to St. Francis, a little bit at a time, a phrase or a line at a time. It opened up for me and revealed itself to me. And I don't even want to share that with you how, because I'd like for you to discover your own. And I just wonder if we can say that together to get started. And then I invite you to, it wouldn't have to be this prayer. If you are tempted to enjoy some silence during Lent, you might have a poem, you might have a prayer, you might simply let your own thoughts ramble. God is in there somewhere. And there's no urgency with a lot of meditation or a lot of perceptions of what contemplative prayer is, that you need to turn off your thoughts. I'm suggesting that you just let your thoughts run and see where they take you in the silence. Let us pray. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
Rosemary gave me a good segue into talking about silence. And it's easier to have some silence when you're alone, but when you're in a busy family with lots of children running around or teenagers playing their music, it is sometimes harder to have silence. But one of the things that I have learned recently is that silence is important even for young people, that our children are growing up without much silence in their world at all, and that silence is a part of the way that we grow and develop. Not only is it the way we connect to God, but it's the way we connect to each other and the way our brain cells connect to each other. So I would encourage you who are families and have all those noisy things going around is to find a time in your family, even if it's only for 2 minutes before bedtime, or 2 minutes before a meal if you share a meal together, or 2 minutes when you wake up in the morning, to just be quiet. And with little ones you can play a game and say, let's be like a bunny rabbit and not make any noise. And just for a very few minutes, have silence with each other. I would encourage you to do that. My own personal practices have varied over the years. Every year at the seminary for 31 years, they have given me suggestions, and some I've tried to follow and some I haven't. Mostly for me, I take on something that is that's meaningful for me. And I'll tell you a story that happened just last week. I was walking home after Ash Wednesday, and 2 young women were walking behind me. They had just come from St. Mary's. And they were trying to decide what to do. So one said, well, I think I'm going to say my rosary every day. I don't say my rosary every day. And the other one said, well, I say my rosary every day, but I can't give up anything because I've already given up smoking and drinking and several other things. And she said, I feel like my whole year has been a sacrifice. And they were right behind me, and I couldn't help myself. So I turned around and I said, what gives you joy? And she said, I like to say my rosary. So I said, then that's what you should do for Lent. You should make it your discipline that you will say your rosary every day. And don't worry about all the other stuff. And if you end up at the end of Lent still saying your rosary every day, you will have accomplished something. So that's the other thing I want to say to you. The practices that you take on for Lent shouldn't be practices that you take back when Easter comes. The idea is to take on a practice that will enrich your life not only during Lent, but for the rest of your lives.
So think carefully about what you're doing and whether that can be meaningful for you and give you some joy.
I think we're way past segue now, and probably into theme, which is silence, and trying to lower the noise level a little bit. I want to suggest to you first the role that I think, one image that I was given a long time ago for what silence is and the role that it plays in our lives. And then I want to give you a little technique for achieving it that sounds very familiar, but it has a little twist in it. So let me start with the image for silence. Think about a book that you've been reading, a novel or history or whatever it is, and imagine the page of the book. And now start in your mind to remove the punctuation. Take the periods out, take the commas out, take the semicolons out, remove the paragraph markings. As you're doing this, if you try this, you'll realize that the page that you're reading begins to make less and less sense to you. It's a lot of words that are mushed together. But without the punctuation in there, you can't break it into pieces. And the sense of it, the meaning of things, begins to disappear. Silence in our lives is life's punctuation. If you stop for moments during the day, at the end of the day, at the beginning of the day, at various moments during the day, and you put in a period or you put in a comma into your life, by simply staying with some silence for a moment, you open up space in which things can begin to make sense. So it's not just, there's a lot of noise around, and it's very helpful to lower the noise level. There are psychologists who say that, getting the noise level in our brains right is an essential component of mental health. But it's not just that, it's meaning making, it's sense making of life. And if you put a little punctuation in, by using silence to break up this just rapid flow of events, it can help you. With that image, how do you get to silence? Bless you, you turn off the news. You turn off the sort of constant drone of things. If you're in your car, you don't have the voices blasting at you the whole time. But there is a quality to silence that is beyond the absence of noise. And it's moving from silence into stillness of mind that I'm talking about. And you get there through prayer, through quiet. I want to suggest one way to you that, as they say, has a little twist in it. So the prayer book, one of the great resources of life for members of the Episcopal Church, the prayer book has in it on page 136 and following daily devotions for individuals and families. Some of you may know those pages. One for the morning, one for noon, one for early evening, and one for the close of day. I want to suggest to you that when you get home, get your prayer book and take a look at these little devotions. They're quite short. There's just a little piece of a psalm or something in the front. There's a very short reading. There's the Lord's Prayer, and there's a collect at the end of it. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that you simply find a time during the day to pull this out and read it. What I'm suggesting to you is that you pick one or two of the 4 daily devotions. A lot of people, I think, would probably pick the one that's first thing in the morning and one that's at the close of the day or the evening, and memorize it. A lot of us haven't been asked to memorize anything since we were in junior high school, and God knows we've got so much junk in our heads now. I blame user IDs and passwords. We probably used up our memorization space, but it is actually possible. I discovered this myself that even past the age of 50, you can memorize things. And you'd be surprised if you, even with a psalm that goes on for 8 or 10 lines, open my lips, O Lord, and my mouth shall proclaim your praise. By just working with it for a little bit, you will find that you have committed it to memory. So that now you have the first problem licked, which is that if you want to do this regularly, you don't necessarily need to pull out the book and have it in front of you. So if you're sitting on a bus, you're sitting on the metro, you're driving your car, whatever, if you have it memorized, you can do this anywhere at any time. And now here's the little twist. If you stand or sit in the mornings, in the evenings, and you decide that you're going to take this time to do this little set of words from the Psalms, from elsewhere in the Bible, the Lord's Prayer, a collect, you begin to recite the words of this office to yourself. Open my lips, O Lord, and my mouth shall proclaim your praise. And you go on. If you have a turn of mind to do it, and people do, they're just not used to doing it, decide that instead of saying those words which you have memorized, you're going to listen to them. You will find that the words, once they have become familiar, they'll be just kind of going in your head. And you won't have to make that sort of mental effort to say, I am now going to say these words that I have memorized. You will find as you get familiar with them that for longer and longer spaces, you can have the words simply going in your head and listen to them. And what that is doing is it is stilling your mind. It's actually a little variation on a basic technique of meditation. If many of you may be familiar with Asian techniques of one kind, and it's a mantra. And in a mantra, the mantra is sort of saying itself, and you are reaching lower and lower states of kind of silence and peace by simply returning and letting the mantra say itself. In this version of it, let the prayer say itself and listen to it, and you will find that the silence, the stillness of mind increases. So, thank you.
I don't know about y'all, but I have the image of eating dim sum and the little lady's like pushing her trolley around and feeling kind of full. But I think that's one of the great things about hearing from a bunch of different people is we're all created differently and we all need different things. And so I encourage you to think about this as like the dim sum cart coming around and saying like, yes, I'd like some of that, or no, thank you, I'm full right now. I wanted to tell you about the funniest Lenten discipline I've heard about, which is there's an app called We Croak that will text you 5 times a day and just remind you that you're going to die, which a friend of mine was telling me about this, and I thought, that is not something that I really want the reminder of, but she really does. And so it's just a great example of we're all different. One of the things that I did, at least made me think about this, but I had heard about the rite of reconciliation for a long time, but I'd never participated in it before. And the tagline I've heard used in the Episcopal Church is, all may, some should, none must. And I like that framework. And I just, as someone who's really intimidated by it, it was really lovely to be reminded that no matter how I feel like I've fallen short in the ways that my life is not going the way that I think God wants it to, mercy is everlasting, and that mercy is available to us. And I love being reminded in specific ways that I cannot be separated from the love of God. The other thing that we are doing in our household is we've given up meat for Lent. And we're participating in a drive that's happening at the seminary called Menstrual Madness, and it's through the Carpenter Shelter, which is designed to help women who are experiencing what's known as period poverty. There was just a film that won an Oscar about this. And so we're bypassing the meat aisle and headed into the feminine hygiene product aisle and filling our cart with something that we don't need more meat, but there are our neighbors in need who need some help in this particular way, because I didn't know this, but food stamps doesn't cover feminine hygiene products. And so a lot of times, even if you have resources available to you, it doesn't cover everything that you need. There's also a really great article in Teen Vogue about what happens to young girls and how they skip school a lot of times when they're experiencing homelessness in this country, because it's embarrassing for them. So it's very much in vogue, sort of literally, but we are participating in that at the seminary. And then the other thing that I have really appreciated doing over the last few years is something called the Examen, and you may have heard me talk about this before, but the Examen is a Jesuit practice. And I think it's sort of related to this idea of the dim sum cart, but at the end of the day, just taking a few moments to bring yourself into quiet and say, where did I notice God? Where did I feel the absence of God? And it's really just 2 questions, and there's tons of variations on the questions. You can ask things like, when did I feel most joyful? And when did I feel most weighed down? And the idea is that in all of our lives, God is constantly calling us into relationship with God. And the Examen helps us think about and pay attention to what are the dishes in the buffet that are really great for me, and what are the dishes in the buffet that I really don't want any more of. And so it's just a short little contemplative practice designed to make oneself more aware of the presence of the Spirit in all of our lives. And I have really appreciated doing it periodically, but I've never done it every day. And so I'm curious to see what it's like to do it every day, and if I am paying attention to more of what is happening in my life. So, thank you.
The Examen was on my list too, and sort of thinking about a bookend, like wake up in the morning, kind of offer your day to God, and then end with the Examen. Seems like a really good way to kind of wrap it up. And I wanted to give a plug. There's an app that I use on my phone often called Pray As You Go, if you're not familiar with that, and it has silence built into it, it has music built into it, and it has a reading, and then leads you through some questions to let you sort of sink into that reading. So for me, when I have time in my day to take a walk, that's what I do as I walk. So it's like a 11, 12-minute thing that you can do anytime. And so it's just an app. It tells you what to do that day. And actually on the Pray As You Go app, there's also examens for different ages. So there's an examen for kids and families, an examen for youth, an examen for adults. And there's also a Lenten sort of retreat that's on it right now too, that's broken up into several sections that you could do. So if you're looking for sort of a led kind of meditation, those are available on that app. I highly recommend it. We have also, Elise held up some sheets here. One of them is specifically made for families, with ideas for families and things that are going on in church for families. And at the back of these, I wanted to point out, if you do for Advent an Advent calendar, these are sort of a Lenten version of that. So if your kids like sort of coloring and seeing things progress, my kids love this. So each day you can fill in this with whatever beautiful thing and adults can do this too, and kind of pray as you color. It's a way of sort of giving them something to do in that silence that Amy talked about. And I was going to mostly talk about things I do with my family, and some of them are more aspirational than others. But other than that Lenten resource sheet, one thing that I grew up doing and have tried to continue with my family is once a week we have a meal that is meatless and also sort of just cheap, like beans and rice is generally what it ends up being. And we very specifically sort of set another place at the table that's for Jesus that night, and remember Jesus more specifically that night that we are usually good at doing, and save the money that we would have spent on a meal and choose a charity at the end of Lent that the family wants to give the saved money towards. So the kids like to participate in that, and it sort of feels neat to them. One year, I haven't gotten my act together, so I'm not sure we'll do it this year, but one year I made a jar towards the beginning of Lent that had just little slips of paper with ideas of things that maybe we could do that day, like say something kind to a friend today, look for someone lonely today, learn a new prayer today, make up your own grace today. Just interesting, creative ideas that I just thought of. And we put them in the jar, and in the morning, someone would pick one out, and we'd all try to do it that day. And then when we gathered back at the end, we'd try to say, were we able to do this? If so, what happened? And it led to some neat stories. If you're not already saying grace as a family, Lent's a good time to start that. And if that feels daunting, there are all kinds of books out there that have little graces you could learn and sort of add to your family repertoire by the end. I think you were talking about a die that you can roll that has grace on different sides. That might be a fun idea too. Or maybe a prayer before bedtime as a family. We've started whenever we can, which is not always because everybody has their wild and crazy schedules, but we have been trying to gather together as a family for our nighttime prayer. And something that my kids have liked doing, especially my littlest one, is doing blessings for each other. And the kids will sort of in a circle, each person will do a blessing for the person after them. And it's sort of a lovely way to all be kind of praying for each other and thinking about each other. And one of my favorite, trying to give silence to my children, and this is one of the few things that my kids really love to do that is prayerful. We all lie down on the ground in a dark room, and I lead them in this very simple meditation that I highly recommend. And it's just a line from Scripture, be still and know that I am God. And it's kind of a cascading prayer. So you start with the whole sentence, and then with each repetition, you take off one word. So be still and know that I am God. I usually breathe deeply 3 times for some silence. And then be still and know that I am. Be still and know that I, until you get down to be. And then if you've got time, you can build back up, or you can just stop there. But it is silence, it's peace, and there's a lot of meaning, I find. Like when those words are speaking to you and you're hearing them, there's more in that one little line than you could possibly imagine. One of our bright ideas, and this is another aspirational thing, but my oldest daughter said the other day that she's never read like a real Bible. We have 6,000 children's Bibles in our house, and I've given her a Bible, but I don't know that she's done much with it. And so we are going to try to read one of the books of the Bible together as a family. And we've only gotten to Jesus being born yet, so we'll see how that goes. But hopefully we'll move along in that, because it occurred to me when she said that is like we hear snippets all the time on Sundays, but they hadn't heard the whole story. So I think that'll be, hopefully, if we can get our acts together, really interesting. And then for me personally, I am not good at doing what I want to do, and so I need other people to make me do things. And so I am signed up for an Ignatian prayer retreat. I don't know if you know Ignatius, sort of prayer of the imagination, and had these spiritual exercises that he would lead people through. And it would take a month to do the whole spiritual exercise. But there's what's called a Lenten retreat, or an Ignatian retreat in everyday life. And so I'm doing one at a church in Georgetown where for the entire season of Lent, we're going to do 1 week. So I go in once a week, meet with a spiritual director, and he assigns me things to do every day, which means I actually, if I don't want to embarrass myself, when I go see him again, I have to actually do. So that's what I need for Lent. So what do you all do? What works? What doesn't work? Aspirations are fine. Yeah.
So on kind of the silence, for me, it's not so much the noise of sound, but the noise of technology. So for me, I've actually given up all digital media with the exception of work. So like no TV, no social media, no computer TV, all of it is just, and I have found myself to be so much more calm and to have that time for other things that I enjoy, and then be able to get back to what's meaningful in my life.
I've seen that a lot on Facebook. People say, I'm signing off now, you'll see me in Easter. Neat. Wow. What else?
It seems that there's been, before I've always considered Lent to be a time when you're supposed to give up something. And I've heard more where, okay, try doing something. I just said aspirational, something that you can do and it kind of beginning to move for it to not give it up right when Easter hits. Okay, I get it, that's good. And I think that that's been a real switch to me. I mean, in a good way. And because I find that I'm not really good at giving up. I fail all the time. I tried giving up cheese once. Did not work. I made it about a week, and then it was like, oh no, we're all setting in. So I started for this Lent saying the New Zealand prayer at night that we do at 5 o'clock on Sunday a lot. And because I've not been, I during the day I don't take those moments. But it's funny when I'll be reading and I'm just getting ready to go, close the book, turn off the light, and all of a sudden, oh, I haven't said my prayer. So for the last, since Lent started, I've been reading my prayer. And I have to admit, it has made a difference. We're talking, I'll keep going. I do like the aspirational part of Lent that has been presented, that like you can do something, you don't have to just give up. Yeah.
And that's such a beautiful prayer. What has been done has been done. What has not been done has not been done. We all need to hear that.
And unlike Sam, I'm associated with an order too, Society of St. John the Evangelist. Their thing this Lent was about, don't focus on what you give up. Does your life need to be amended? Do you need to do something else? What are you going to proactively do to make the world better, yourself better, your family better, whatever? And focusing on kind of a lot of that. When I get into meditation, which I probably do 3 days a week, because sometimes I just can't get there. I've talked with Amy about this when we do that 4 o'clock thing before the 5 o'clock service on Sunday. It takes me half an hour to shut my head off before I can get to that point where I can do any kind of serious meditation. So I use a mantra as well. It's kind of a thing. Usually I use the Jesus prayer or some other short thing. Even try doing something in Latin. That really works.
Wow.
But I keep trying it all the time. So I just thought what the brothers were saying about what are you going to do, not what are you going to give up. What was meaningful? It's like because part of that rule is I've got to do reconciliation twice a year, once before Advent, once before Lent. And the brothers say, don't focus on all the bad things you did. Focus on the good things you did. Now, you don't have to confess to them. You don't want to. But, I'm retired, I'm a little guy, my life is bad, I haven't done anything bad. I sit there thinking, what am I going to say to Sam today?
I could.
Drink confession.
So what I was thinking this week about the whole process of giving up and or taking on, I was thinking about fasting. This week wasn't great for me for that because I thought, I've got a client in town this week, so I probably can't do any of my energy to be ready for that and this coming week as well. But then I thought, what I've decided on doing is reading some of the biblical stories about either folks who were tempted or who suffered, like the book of Job kind of struck me. I really have never read that book. So maybe reading that and reading it again and trying to see the different other times in the Bible where someone is tempted or is suffering but trusts in the Lord to bring them through that suffering or that temptation is something that I haven't done before, but I think I'll probably do this time.
I was a raised Catholic, like I'm sure many of us in the Episcopal faith, and I always had the discipline of giving things up, and then as I got older, it was adding more, to focus on doing good things, and then in my adult life with family and children, it's looking at it all, saying what is different between Lent and a New Year's resolution. And I think a lot of people go into Lent thinking, well, it's like a New Year's resolution, except I know that there's a finite end to it. Well, this is great. It's like a light switch. I can turn something on and I can kind of flip it off at Easter. And kind of meet what I want to do. And I think sometimes it can't be like a light switch where you can easily turn it off. It's got to be like coal or like fire with burning wood, and after that fire goes out, the embers are still hot, far past the end of Lent. I think as you think about things in Lent to give up or to take away, thinking about what are those things that are going to have that very long-lasting impact to your life, to your relationships with others and with God. So looking back, I was like, oh, I always give up candy and sweets and sugar and things like that. And I'd feel great. I'd feel a lot healthier. And then Easter Sunday would come, and I would eat an entire bag of Cadbury mini eggs. And my sister and I would be sick, because I'd call her up and say, what'd you give up? Candy? What'd you do today? Binge on candy. And we'd be sick. I'm like, I didn't really learn my lesson in that situation. So, yeah, it's just something I think about. I know a couple of years I actually went to church every single day during Lent. And I felt like that was a really nice way to start my day. 6:30 service. I lived up in McLean. It was a nice way of starting my day. I did that for a couple of years, but I feel like maybe it helped me during that time, it helped me a little later, but that's the stuff I think that lasting impact.
Thank you. That's a good ending point, I think. May that light of God be lit in each of us this season. Amen.